As always, Annamarie Van der Merwe, Executive Chair at Flirt Rock. It's my absolute privilege and to welcome you to our, what I think is our final In Conversation with session for 2023. We do still have next week the ISO 37000 webinar and discussion with Carolyn Chalmers. But as far as our lunch hour In Conversation with sessions for this year, cannot believe how fast we are speeding towards year end. And we have an interesting topic today. I'm kind of, thinking about it this morning in preparation that we've left the heavy stuff. We've left it sort of, towards the end when people are probably kind of, not that keen anymore to listen to the heavy stuff. But this is it is an important topic on climate change, and hopefully during the course of this hour, we will also convince you on that. When we talk climate change, I was looking at kind of the 4 C's, and it's climate change, it's contentious, and it's complicated. If you want to kind of have an acronym for anything, I think that would be a good acronym for climate change. Climate change is contentious and it's complicated. But we're very fortunate to be joined in this hour, and I'm very relieved that I don't have to address you on the topic and that I have the likes and the caliber of Dave Collins in the room with me. Dave is by profession, qualification, master's degree in chemical engineering that he got a few years ago, Dave, from Cambridge University. Nearly 50 years in total working with management, working as a consultant, 50 years of experience, which that in itself should tell you, what the level of expertise that we do have in the room. Dave has been working for the past couple of years with top JSE listed companies, with industry associations like BUSA, NBI, really on trying to see how we can pave the way forward, and create the pathways for a decarbonized and a climate resilient South Africa in 2050. Which means, Dave, you just have to kind of just have another 20 years to go. And I think then you can probably think of retiring. By then I think you've earned yours. If you can reach your 2050 targets, you've definitely earned your stripes. But Dave is a specialist and an expert in climate change, in the entire concept of our transitions and the transitions to net zero and net zero carbon economy. And to bring in the complications, also understanding the associated kind of the technological, political, and societal challenges, which there are many of. And we're going to kind of try in a very short period of time to note a few of those for you as well. Dave and I agreed that we're going to kind of break down this conversation in the hour in 3 main focus areas. We're going to just quickly look at globally what's happening as far as climate change is concerned. And I think as recent as yesterday, Dave, talking about globally, I see Pope Francis have called on the richer governments to kind of use COP28 in Dubai and really to make it a turning point. Now, we've gone from COP to COP to COP and lots of talk, but, it's kind of the deliverable and the walk has been not as easy, I think, as they were hoping it would be. So we're going to look a little bit globally, then we're going to bring it closer to home, to South Africa. And in South Africa itself, I was looking at last year, April, already the BBC actually had a report on a study that was done on the Southern Africa storms and weather patterns, and linking that directly to climate change. It had to do with the storms in Mozambique, in Malawi, in Madagascar. Can you imagine what that study, the additional material that was brought about by the recent storms we had at the absolute southern tip of Africa. And this morning, the executive director of what's called the Presidential Climate Commission actually was quoted as saying that in South Africa in particular, it's no longer, climate change is no longer an environmental issue. It's actually going to impact what he says the pace at which we, uh, um, the pace at which we do kind of address climate change is going to have a direct impact on the country's long-term economic and human development prospects. And one of the complications, Dave, is that his statement was kind of underscored by NUM, the National Union of Mine Workers, who acknowledges in a statement the issue about climate change, but then immediately say, we need to kind of move forward slowly to this transition. We need to delay it, in fact, because we are also potentially impacting what they call 25,000 direct jobs and 26,000 indirect jobs, in especially the coal value chain. So, Dave, with a little bit of that intro, setting the scene on globally and South Africa, can I open the floor to you? But ladies and gentlemen, you know the drill by now. You've got the Q&A or the chat. I'm going to keep my eye on that while Dave is addressing us. Any observation, any comment, you're very welcome to drop it in there. And as we go through during the session, we will respond to those. So Dave, I'm going to hand over to you and welcome and say just already thank you so much for your willingness to share your expertise with us this morning. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Annamarie. And as always, can I check that I'm on full screen and that you can hear me?
You are. We can hear you and you're on screen. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for the introduction. I think after that, I'm looking forward to hearing what I'm going to say. Annamarie mentioned these three issues. The first one is, she used the words contentious and complicated. Yes, there's lots that is complicated, complex. There's lots that's contentious. I think it's very important to understand this first point before we can even think about what's happening in South Africa and what you need to do. And I'm sure you've all thought a lot about what you need to do already, and you're all wondering what's happening in South Africa. But to me, the really important one is this first one, because there is so much noise out there. I even got an invitation a couple of days ago to attend a dinner in Calgary tomorrow night, Calgary, Canada. At 3 days' notice, it was a bunch of denialists trying to deny the science. This kind of nonsense still happens a bit, but the science is not contentious. So let's move into now just discussing what the complexities are in this whole global issue. First of all, we've all heard of black swans, and a black swan is unexpected. It's like the European explorers who pitched up in Australia, I don't know, 1700, and saw black swans. Huge shock. Climate change is not a black swan. It is expected. It's coming down the track. It's swimming towards us. So let's not kid ourselves that it's a sort of an unknown thing. It's happening already. And if we go back to the Bible, which has got various translations of this verse from Genesis, but look at the wording. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, rule over the fish, the birds, and every living thing. That's what we tried to do for the last, I guess, ever since we came out of the last ice ages. We've tried to subdue Earth, to see Earth as a subset of our economy. Well, what happened? Population's gone mad, up to 8 billion now. The world GDP has followed a similar kind of trend, particularly after like 1750, the Industrial Revolution in Europe, and then following into other countries. Emissions, carbon emissions, took off around 1800, again because of the Industrial Revolution, and then took off even more in the 1950s and onwards, even into the periods where most of us were born. The emissions are really accelerating because of the industrialization of India and China, etc. But what happened then? That has resulted in a temperature change over the last 50 years. You can see the Arctic up there is red. That is going up to 4 degrees Celsius already. The reason for the different temperature rises over the planet. It's just geophysics and ocean currents. It's a very complex subject. But everything I'm giving you here is science. This is what has happened. We all know about fires and tornadoes and floods. We all know too well. I'm now living in the Western Cape, and we had our drama 10 days ago. And what's very interesting now, science has got to the point where science can say a particular event might have been more likely to have happened because of our emissions. And the KZN, this comment here refers to the KZN floods of last year. They were twice as likely to have happened because of climate change, anthropogenic, human-caused climate change. Science has got to that stage. Some events, like you may have read about the place in British Columbia 2 years ago, who somewhere, I've forgotten the name, has got to 40 degrees Celsius and it burned out. That was, I think, 9 times more likely to have happened because of climate change. So the reality is not that we try to subdue the environment. The reality is that we are a subset through society of the environment. And it's interesting that people are now beginning to realize that. I'm sure you've all thought about this, that really there has to be this, I don't know if the right word is compromise, but there has to be this deal between society, the economy, and the environment, where there is a sweet spot in the middle where we can actually be sustainable. That is now where all ESG is taking us. I'm sure you know that. But this business about everything has a technical solution is not true. Many things do have technical solutions, but overall, we have to see ourselves as a subset of nature, of the environment. Otherwise, we're going to get badly bitten. We're already being badly bitten. The concept of tipping points is a very interesting and a very important one, that we're not just looking at emissions going up slowly year by year and weather events going up slowly year by year. It's not like that. It's going to be rather more, we're going to build up pressure. Think of an earthquake. Think of the San Andreas Fault in California. It moves a little bit, a little bit, a little bit, and then one of these days it's going to blow like it did in 1906. We saw that in Turkey recently as well. So think about it like an earthquake. The pressures build up, and then there's a tipping point. And within nature, many tipping points have been identified, things that can really go wrong quite quickly. And one of the scarier ones is one up here in the top right-hand corner, the permafrost. There's a whole bunch of methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas trapped in ice in the Arctic and on the North Russia coast. And as the Arctic warms up more quickly than the rest of the planet, as we mentioned earlier, increasingly the chances are that that will suddenly release. And because it releases, it causes more global warming and the whole thing gets out of control. So we've got to worry about tipping points. There's not just physical tipping points, it's social tipping points. You may remember back in France, back in 2018, the Gilets jaunes, who protested and nearly took down the government. And that was partially caused by President Macron's imposition of taxes on fossil fuels to try to shift the economy. And this, those of you who know a bit of French will be able to translate that. It's very simple. I do not want your new world. And that's the thing that we're up against. If people in South Africa, for example, are not going to have water, as I understand, I left Johannesburg about 6 months ago. I understand things are not brilliant up there. At some point, people are really going to tip. So we're looking at physical tipping points and social tipping points caused by climate change. I'm just going to do another couple of slides, and then let's just talk about this big picture, this global issue, and then we can take some discussion, and then we can move more into South Africa and what we need to do. The transition ahead, and there is no doubt there's a transition ahead. Annamarie mentioned the Presidential Climate Commission. That part of their job is to oversee this transition for the South African economy to 2050 and beyond. It's been driven by two things. Obviously, what we've just been talking about, which is the need to decarbonize. It's a response to climate change. But as always, technology is there. And we seem to be in one of these periods where there is so much innovation. There's all the AI, obviously, but there's also a lot of technical innovation in other things. It looks like everything that can be electrified will be. Like, for example, at present, about 20% of our economies, global, 20% of that energy comes from electricity. The rest of it comes from liquid fuels, petrol, diesel, oil, gas, etc. But that number looks like it's going to go over 50% by 2050. So everything's going to be electrified. And the two big things in this transition, the two big technical points, we all know about the electricity transition in South Africa. You know, we all get wound up about stage 6 or maybe stage 7. We hear about the slow movement, but it is happening. And fossil fuel plants are being shut down, and they're being replaced by solar and wind. And that in itself is a whole process that I'm sure you're reading about and Annamarie mentioned earlier. The other big one is transport. That's just beginning to happen, where there will be this move away from oil and gas to electricity, to electric cars, electric vehicles. Interesting that, as you've probably picked up, there was a lot of resistance to the electricity transition. There still is. Annamarie mentioned this morning and a couple of days ago that the National Union of Mine Workers and the metal workers are concerned about the job losses as we move away from fossil fuels to renewables. All these things, yes, indeed, are real concerns. But at least electricity is happening. The transition in transport is just beginning to happen. And it's still very slow in South Africa for a host of reasons. Now, just finishing off now with the global response to climate change. This is a very important set of numbers here. It's well worth remembering a couple of these concepts. Science is saying that we mustn't go above 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial times by 2100. Otherwise, we're going to have these tipping points, or the probability of these tipping points will increase rapidly above 1.5 degrees. We're already at 1.2, by the way, above pre-industrial times. That's why we're seeing the things that we're seeing, the KZN floods, the wildfires in Greece, the wildfires in Canada, Australia, etc. And that's a very important number to remember, 1.5 max. What comes along with that is it means net zero emissions by 2050. No more carbon emissions by 2050, net. Net simply means that if you do have a little bit left, you must be able to pull it out of the air with some technology. So the whole global response to climate change is premised on those two things, 1.5 degrees, zero emissions by 2050. And if you look at this chart of emissions with time going up to 2100, the bottom one is getting to zero around 2050. That's what we need for 1.5. Current policies are taking us to 2.7. 2.7 may not sound a lot above 1.5, but if you think that we're seeing already what we're seeing at 1.2 degrees already since pre-industrial times, it's just mind-boggling to think about what might be happening if we get 2.7. And that's all beginning to happen already. So that is what science is saying, and that is what the world is nominally agreeing that we have to do. But the current stated goals for this net zero, the EU 2050, full marks to the EU. The EU is going for it. The EU is trying to get a competitive advantage by getting ahead of the rest of the world with technology, and also protecting their citizens and their country, which will not be as vulnerable to climate change as other places like South Africa. South Africa has also got the lofty goal of being net zero by 2050. It's a goal, it's not a legal requirement. China, however, is 2060 and India is 2070. And that is as far as they're prepared to go. China has not committed to 2050. So already something like 40–50% of the emissions of the world, between China and India, are already not compliant with 1.5. So what we're now seeing increasingly, and I've been watching this space for a long time, but I've seen it even the last few months and certainly the last year or two, there's increasing talk of governments now saying, yeah, this is all very well, all this reducing emissions, but we have to balance our socioeconomic development against emissions reduction. And there's increasingly talk of delaying the emissions reduction in order to be able to use fossil fuels to get countries, developing countries particularly, up to a higher level of development. So the net result of all of this, in my opinion, I think an awful lot of people are saying this as well, is that we're going to overshoot 2050, which means we're going to overshoot 1.5 degrees, which means that we're going to have a lot of problems. The global response is really summarized. This is a cartoon just caught my eye 2 days ago from The Economist, last Economist. There's the lion saying, that's what we need, the ferocity that we need to attack this problem, and we just got a bunch of pussycats. We're just not doing it. They're all crying a bit and meowing, but we're not doing it. And the consequence of this is that, yeah, our current policies are headed for 2.7. I'm pretty sure that something will happen. There will be further efforts, but we're going to miss 1.5. And if you talk to, Annamarie mentioned the Presidential Climate Commission, there's lots of smart people there. There's lots of smart people in business. All the people that are looking at this and thinking about this, and all the scientists are really saying, hey guys, we are not going to make it. We're going to end up somewhere in the middle. And what does that somewhere in the middle mean before we move into South Africa and before we take some questions? Let's say we're headed for somewhere between 1.5 and 2.7. Let's call it 2.5 degrees. We're going to be double that amount in sub-Saharan Africa. So those of you who are now in Johannesburg, Pretoria, by 2100 and a long time before that, you're going to be up 4 to 5 degrees warmer. That's just, again, the nature of the geophysics of the earth and the air circulation and the ocean circulation. And that's going to give rise to two sets of risks. The first ones, and these are ones we'll mention at the end when we talk about what companies need to do, physical risks. You're going to have more weather damage. It's as simple as that. And we all know what that means. We're going to need to adapt. We're going to need to accept that it's going to be hotter or more violent storms. Or at a more silly level, my dear wife, since we moved to Cape Town, has had 2 umbrellas blown out back to front because of the winds, extreme winds. And we're going to have to spend money on resilience, building more resilient infrastructure. Chapman's Peak Road, for example, you may well be aware, is wiped out in one particular place. 2 meters of boulders on the road will wash out from the mountains. That's out for a month or 3. We're going to have to spend money on resilience. So that's physical risks. The transition risks are a bit more subtle, but just as problematical. We're still going to need to transition because remember, we're not saying we're going to do nothing. We're going to say we're not going to do enough. We still have to do a lot. So we're going to have carbon costs. We'll mention it when we get to South Africa. There is a carbon pricing regime in South Africa now. It's hopelessly inadequate, by the way. Like all other countries, it's nowhere near where it needs to be, the levels of carbon pricing to affect change. Reputation costs are a risk. If you do not move, and if you're not seen to be moving in the eye of the public and making your operations less carbon intensive, etc., you're going to have a reputational problem. What about obsolescence? Maybe we just don't need steel anymore that's made. ArcelorMittal is a wonderful example in South Africa, where, as you probably know, steel is currently made from iron ore. You add coking coal and you get off lots and lots of carbon dioxide. That steel is deemed to be dirty steel, like the steel in the rest of the world. Europe is now rushing ahead to make what's called green steel, where they use hydrogen to remove the oxygen from the iron ore to make the steel. And that hydrogen is made with renewable electricity. So old style steel will become obsolescent and new steel will become the norm. The good news is, of course, there's lots and lots and lots of opportunities for new products. Lots and lots and lots. And I find in my experience, when people look at risks and opportunities, it is so easy to see the negative risks. It's so much more difficult to see and to plan the opportunities, but they are there. And of course, you can enhance your reputation. Um, there's a well-known bank in South Africa whose corporate color is green, which I think they chose accidentally about 25 years ago. And you all know who I'm talking about. I won't mention it. But they're pumping that now. They're saying, "Hey, we're a green bank, and good luck to them." And they actually are quite good with their emissions. But reputation you can also enhance. So, Annamarie, I think it'll be a good time just before we get into South Africa, which is probably better known in some ways to the people attending. But can we just see what thoughts there are? And I'll go out of full screen so I can see as well. But
Okay,
you
Dave.
can guide me.
Yeah, no, yeah, right now at this stage, we don't have any specific questions from our audience. And I think maybe when we've got covered all three of the areas, there may be. But if I can just make an observation, listening to you, one kind of wonders whether you kind of feel like we're fighting a losing battle, and it's like, is it even worth trying? Kind of those are the ideas that come across my mind, especially if the larger, and this is where the complexity comes in, that you have all of these role players, all of their own challenges and agendas, etc. Some, buying into this whole challenge, and others maybe more window dressing, etc., etc. So, yeah, this is really for me, and I know you were talking about the naysayers. A lot of people that see this as just another element of the attempt to bring one world order, and this is just part of their strategy. But I mean, to your point, science, the facts are there. We've seen it. You can't ignore what is happening around us, even in our country. I always remember a few years ago, I was listening to a conversation, the early days of the concept of climate change, and the topic was about the impact of climate change on agriculture. In South Africa in particular, as we go into South Africa. And I remember the person being interviewed saying, in my great grandchildren's days, life, one day, living in Pretoria, they will, on a Saturday morning, wake up and say to their children, "So, which wine farm are we going to go to today?" The wine farms will be, around Pretoria, no longer be in the Cape. And sugarcane, you will not find a sugarcane field in KZN anymore. That will be, and. So it was really kind of trying to explain how agriculture needs to start adapting to the change, and the impact it has on them. So yeah, just an observation from my side that I absolutely feel point. The science shows it to us. We see it happening. If you go and look at the website at NOAA, the space NASA at the US, they have a website on vital signs of the planet. And they were just reporting that very recently that the Arctic sea ice was at its lowest maximum level ever. So we are just going one way. That's just for sure.
Yeah, you made a good point there. I'll cover it in a few minutes. I was talking at Business Unity South Africa last week, and somebody said, "Geez, how can you expect us to take this stuff seriously when we're in the swamp of no electricity, no water, or unreliable supplies, theft, etc., etc., etc. We are battling on a daily basis to survive. How can you expect us to even take this stuff seriously? And my answer is very simple. You have to. You've got to look at the long view. You've got to look at the short view. You have to keep an eye on all three. Otherwise, you're going to miss out very badly.
Yeah, and we're going to come to the point about what companies can do as well. But if I can wrap up the section before you go into your next slide, maybe I do know that if Prof. Mervyn King was on the call now, he would have said to directors on the call, if you don't take this seriously, you're actually failing in your fiduciary duties to the company
Yep.
to ensure its long-term sustainability. So that in
Yep.
itself, is a kind of a bit of a wake-up call. But let's talk a little bit about what's happening in South Africa.
Yeah. And to your point, without scaremongering too much, can you imagine if there is some catastrophic event and then the fingers start pointing and saying, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? How could you possibly have built a new factory next door to a forest or next door to a donga or something where there's going to be a flood? Yeah, so we have to think about these things. Okay, so what is happening in South Africa? Now, obviously, what's happening in South Africa is a subset of what's happening globally with local flavors and local issues. Few things. As I said, we have made the announcement. Minister Creasy made the announcement, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, that we have a goal to go to net zero emissions by 2050, even though subsequently China has come out at 2060, India 2070. As you all know, we do have carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is, just to give you some numbers, I didn't put this in the slide, but just to tell it to you verbally, currently carbon pricing, by the time you allow for all the tax-free allowances and all that kind of thing, you're looking at $3 or $4 a ton of CO2. By 2050, for the world to be net zero, that number has to be $250. So draw a straight line from $4 today, say, over the next 27 years to 250. That'll give you an indication of what is coming down the track. Now, not that anyone in 2050, unless they need their head read, is going to be paying $250, because they will have said, hey, it's much cheaper for me to switch to this new technology or this new product that doesn't emit CO2. Therefore, I don't have to pay the tax penalty. And that's the whole point of carbon pricing. It's going to force that kind of change. It's going to make things like green hydrogen made from renewable electricity to make it more attractive. We have a climate change bill that has been debated and discussed for years now, but it's at the stage of a bill, well beyond the paper now. So everything's being put in place in South Africa for an appropriate response to climate change that is in keeping with world development. It's all there. And another one I didn't put in here is adaptation. It's much less well developed, but there is a national adaptation strategy that has been talked about to try to ensure that the municipalities who are battling already, can you imagine, with resources, etc., can you imagine now they're going to be hit with a whole set of requirements for adaptation? Something else has happened. You probably heard about two things here. The European carbon border taxes. I mentioned earlier, green steel is a great example. The European Union, a week ago, has begun to implement a scheme to tax the carbon that's implicit in products that they import. And if you imagine, I mentioned the example of steel, because we've used coal to smelt the iron ore, because we've used Eskom electricity, which is very unclean electricity by world standards, there is a lot of implied, implicit carbon in that steel, which the Europeans will work out and then say, we're not going to hit you with a border tax, which at present is about $100, €100 roughly a ton. So the Europeans are already well on their way to 250. We're not. We're at $4. The Europeans are at 100. But they will then start taxing our steel in the next couple of years. The exact date is not clear. They will start taxing our imports, our wine, anything that has implicit carbon in it. And as long as our electricity, we're using electricity from Eskom, which is going to take decades to decarbonize, you're going to have a carbon footprint in your product. So any exports that you have to Europe will be taxed. We received, I'm sure you heard the great fanfare that we received 8.5 billion. I'm sorry, I wish it were trillion. 8.5 billion in financing support, and that was really to facilitate the move away from coal, the move away into electric vehicles, and the move into hydrogen. That was about 2 years ago, and it's one of the PCC, the Presidential Climate Commission's objectives, is to facilitate all of that. And again, Annamarie mentioned at the beginning that the National Union of Mine Workers and NUMSA are saying, hey guys, hold on, this is moving far too quickly. We don't see how our jobs are going to be protected of the people that are going to lose jobs through this 8.5 billion development plan. So there's a local issue that's really raising its head. As far as the electricity sector is concerned, yes, it is slowly decarbonizing because very small amounts of solar and wind are being brought on. The logjam was released, was it 18 months ago when President Ramaphosa overrode Minister Montashi and removed a lot of the constraints. Eskom, as you know, has been restructured, again, with resistance to make it more like a modern utility. And I mentioned the NUM resistance. So there's some things that are happening, but increasingly we're hearing this view that the developed North caused the problem, which is correct. It was Europe initially, the Industrial Revolution, followed by the Americans, and then ultimately followed by China. And of course, all those countries are in the north of the equator. So the view is increasingly being expressed that the developed North caused the problem. They must support the developing South, which is India, South Africa. Even though India is mostly north of the equator, it is deemed to be part of the South. And even our president last week said this transition mustn't compromise development. So it's this noise that we're increasingly hearing that, hey guys, you know, we can't go for 2050 net zero emissions. We have to take account of our socioeconomic development needs. And we'll get to this other stuff later. Meanwhile, the world will have warmed 2.5 degrees and causing another set of problems. And then we see things like this, just from a couple of months ago. There's now huge pressures, apparently, seemingly supported by the Ministry of DMRE, Mineral Resources and Energy, to accelerate the expansion of oil and gas in South Africa, in Southern Africa, but including South Africa. So there's going to be more emissions. Rather than moving away from oil and gas, again, the story is being given that we need gas, particularly to industrialize South Africa. And if we don't do that, we're going to miss out. So there you go. There's more noise that is working against the 2050 vision. I'm not making a value judgment. I'm just saying it's not a straight and white. Science says this, therefore it's going to happen. It's not that way. It's worth noting, and this is some work that I was very much involved in over the last 3 years, with Boston Consulting Group, Business Unity South Africa, National Business Initiative. We developed a pathway for South Africa to reach net zero emissions by 2050. That 40 odd million tons in 2050 would be removed by nature-based sinks, carbon capture, things like that. So there is a technical pathway that has been demonstrated to be feasible by 2050. And of course, it's going to cost money, but it is possible. So that work has been done. It's not that it's impossible. It's not that we have to throw our hands up and say, we can't do it. We can do it, but it's going to require a huge amount of money and support. And that's just some, don't worry about the detail, there's just some milestones. that are mentioned. Just look at transport, for example. By 2025, we have to have charging infrastructure. By 2035, under transport, no more petrol and diesel sales. 750,000 electric vehicles on the road by 2030. Those kind of milestones have been set. They're not government policy by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a way of getting to 2050 net zero. And the Presidential Climate Commission that we mentioned earlier are very much behind this work and are really promoting this kind of approach as well. So in conclusion on South Africa, I just put these points together. It is happening. Climate change is happening. It was 5 or 10 years ago, it was something of interesting scientific discussion. It's now happening all around us. The global response is inadequate, that's a fact. And in my opinion, it's likely to remain so. And I think most of us feel that way. South Africa is going to suffer from both physical risks, all the damage, but also the transition risks, for example, the border taxes and exports. Adaptation and building resilience is going to be essential. And the problem is going to get worse for at least a couple of decades. It has not peaked. It has not plateaued. It's going to get worse. So that's where we stand in South Africa today. I think all the things are in place. The climate change bill is happening. Carbon pricing is beginning to happen. We've got the Vision 2050. But meanwhile, there's lots and lots and lots of discussions, and it's a very, very messy process.
Yeah, I think, Dave, before we start talking about kind of what companies have to do in the last 20 minutes that we have left, or 15 minutes, um, I think this is where the complexity comes in. You know, there are so many moving parts. There are so many, and quite rightly, the comment that was made about, you know, the noise around with many other things are so huge. How do we prioritize, and you know, as companies as well, with all of this happening around us? But as we say, the reality is this is going to have a very real impact on business, on also strategy for businesses. Because on the one hand, you know, and I'm kind of now already preempting, I suppose, the next discussion, but really to me is the two tiers of the plan. On the one is what do we do to do, you know, make our contribution to reaching these targets, but at the same time, how do we prepare ourselves for the targets not being reached and the impact that's going to have on our business and what our business looks like in the future. Just coming back to South Africa, you know, and what you've just put up are really very impressive. And it's wonderful to see the kind of work that's already there. But there is a kind of a roadmap. We have concrete plans, and you know, that can work. We do, I think, see that there's probably a lack of political will, you know, that's starting to become stronger than it was, you know, a few years ago, maybe. Obviously, also have to take into consideration we've got elections coming up, and therefore, you know, government also needs to speak to that kind of script as well. But how confident are you that there is enough capacity, capability, commitment in this country for us to actually achieve the 2050 target?
I'm afraid I have to look, Annamarie, to the electricity sector as an example of our capability. Um, it's taken 10 years too long, certainly 5, if not 10 years too long, to get to the point we're at today. We've moved too little, too late. As a result of that, we've got all our load shedding issues. As we all know, for a bunch of reasons, we have load shedding. But I don't think we can pride ourselves in saying that we are good at. Maybe we're quite good at vision. Everybody's good at vision. Everybody loves to get there. I see the future, all that kind of stuff. But to have a policy in place to achieve that vision, to have the plans in place, and then to actually implement. So my opinion is it's not a very optimistic one. I think a realistic one is that we will we will just sputter along. We'll manage um, more and more damage than we should have had, more risks than we should have had. We'll get there somewhere in the end, but at a much lower level of the economy than we could have had if we'd grabbed this by the horns and really taken it seriously. But then that comment applies to a lot of stuff. You know, look at the problems with Transnet, Eskom. It's not just addressing climate change. And it's back to this point about the swamp. You know, if we can't get our exports down the railway lines to Richards Bay, you know, who's worried about climate change? And you know, I'm probably the oldest person in the room, and I read lots of history, and uh, I read more history than anything else. I think this is normal, honestly. This kind of not moving quickly enough, and some people getting upset, some people resisting. It's all quite normal stuff. So we shouldn't get too depressed about it. We should just do the best we can and accept that it's a messy process. Democracy, as somebody once said, is a very messy process. But I think it was Churchill, I'm probably misquoting him. It's a messy process, but it's the best one we found yet. And we're just going to accept the mess and carry on and not get depressed and not give up.
Yeah, when you were referring, Dave, to the different tipping points, I was thinking, I don't know whether you've ever read the book. I think it's Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point. It's
Yep.
a very, very, very good book to read to understand how society works and how things can just be pushed over the edge. You know, slowly.
Yep.
It's like a little frog in the you know, the water kind of story as well. But yeah, then all of a sudden we just wake up and you know, it's there's the disaster is on our doorstep. I was thinking also while you were talking about South African context, and you were talking about electrical, you know, electric vehicles. I was fortunate just in September to spend a week walking in France with my son and spending some time in the Netherlands again. And, you know, my children drive electric vehicles there. Everywhere you go, there are stations to charge. You know, they have a charging station at home. Everything is really, you know, it enables them to do that, which is wonderful. I was quite excited the other day to see at my local shopping mall one charging station, you know, for electric vehicles.
Yep.
While,
Yep.
you know, in Europe, every parking has got kind of, you know, tens of those to charge your vehicle. If you then think with, so number one, to your point, you know, we're not ready. Number two, we sit with a taxi industry with millions of taxis. You know, that is probably quite a large contributor to all of this as well, apart from all our other vehicles. How do you go thinking about the political kind of strategy it will take just to change that industry to make a
Yes.
difference is, yeah.
Yes. And of course, without obviously pointing any fingers, there are lots of vested interests, and vested interests. I'm talking about industry. I mean, that's the way life works. And again, I go back to my reading of history. That's just the way life work. The way life works, the incumbents will hold on, resist. I mean, the Exxon Mobil's of the world are infamous for sowing doubt about climate change science in the 19 no in the 2000s, I think. They weren't just resisting; they were actually trying to debunk the science. So all these forces are at play, and yeah, we'll muddle through, but not in very good shape, I think.
So if we, in the last kind of 10 minutes at our disposal, then talk a little bit about what can companies do?
Yeah, I think we've actually touched on it to a large degree. There's some obvious sort of little bullet points I can give here, but I mean, it's pretty clear from what we've been talking about. It's this concept of the swamp. When people are worried about no electricity, no water, how can I run my business? And you want me to worry about climate change? Yeah, sorry, yes, you do. Because when you get out of the swamp, one of these days, and we are assured by Minister Ramakopa that we will be out of the swamp, we will be out of the electricity swamp in 2 years, whatever. And then you're going to say, okay, oh my God, I've missed this opportunity because I could have got into a new business that is necessary to adjust to climate change. So we've got to look beyond the swamp. Um, you really have to engender climate and carbon awareness in your organization. It sounds boring and flippant, but you've got to do articles, you've got to just make sure everybody is aware of it. And I think there's been a tremendous progress made in the last 3 to 4 years within companies on that. Identify your physical and transition risks and then mitigate them. My experience of that is it's amazing when you start involving people below the C-suite in this kind of thing. It's amazing what people come up with. They think about what things can go wrong, what we need, what they need to address. So I would say involve as many people as you can in identifying these risks and then try to mitigate against them, trying to make a plan. And if that fails, get insurance for as long as you can get insurance, because one of these days, insurance is not going to be very happy about insuring uh, um, uh, a factory that's been built next to a floodplain of a river or something, even if it's 100-year flood. Well, we all know what's happening. 100-year floods are coming every 5 years now. Be ready to adapt. Pretty obvious, it's going to get hotter, it's going to get more violent, because there's so much more energy in the system because everything is warmer. That's just going to not just cause physical damage, but it means we will have to adapt to it and be ready for it. Miners, for example, look at the experience in Australia where you get guys driving around in air-conditioned vehicles all the way, and then be ready. And this is a tricky one. Be ready for sudden changes from tipping points. And maybe the great example: who was ready for COVID? Nobody. And we say, yeah, but it was a black swan. Well, it wasn't really a black swan because black swan is totally unexpected. It was on the cards that at some point in the next, it's going to happen again, that viruses are going to suddenly burst out and try to kill us all. So just be ready for tipping points, even if you can't identify what they are. Just have contingency plans, have a mindset of agility that you can be ready to change if something goes wrong. And that's all the negative stuff. There are opportunities. That wonderful expression, there are opportunities for Africa here. Really, there are so many if you just think about them. And they're the ones that are more difficult to identify. But if you see where the world's going to be going, where South Africa is going to be going, the opportunities, just get people into that mindset and they will start popping out. And then I just put a quote here to finish off, Annamarie, from the flyer for this event. And I think it's very well put. The climate change agenda is no longer just a mere environmental concern. It's an essential part of business strategy. I would go so far as to say it's not something that should be with ESG people. It's part of business strategy. Absolutely. It's something you have to do on a daily basis.
No, absolutely. I can't agree with you more. I think, just while I was listening to as well, the words that came into my mind is crisis management as well. Our crisis management plans that, at a high level, to have those in place as well. And we've had good, in inverted commas, kind of experiences with COVID to see what the extent is of what those kind of, disasters can be. I was wondering as I was, also listening to whether, to some extent, load shedding, and I'm also one of the like everybody else, feeling like a victim and feeling sorry for ourselves because of the, the discomfort and frustration it has brought about. But I was like wondering whether load shedding wasn't actually a blessing in disguise, because to some extent it has forced us, it has actually forced us into a different way. So the solar coming up, and in fact, we have one question in the Q&A. Thanks, Colette, for asking this question. I was getting worried that our audience are not there, but Colette was saying, can I ask if you have any information about the use of solar energy here in South Africa, and if that is increasing significantly? Do we, this is where my thought came about load shedding maybe have been a blessing for us as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's two very interesting points there. One is you're talking about load shedding, which has forced us to consider our demand for energy. And then the other question is about the supply, which is from solar. So yes, I mean, the load shedding has been a bit like the water crisis in Cape Town in 2016, and I'm sure I got my numbers wrong, but I think everyone was using an average of 1,600 liters a day before the crisis, and now they're using 800, and that seems to be permanent. Whatever the numbers are, there's been a very permanent structural shift in water demand in Cape Town. And load shedding has done something similar, um, forcing people realizing that, hot water is maybe not as critical as a light, for example, and it uses a lot more energy. So we're a lot more aware, absolutely. It, like there's always a sort of a silver lining to to a cloud. And then on the question about solar, it's very low at present. It's like 1 or 2, 3%. And always, by the way, a subtlety here. One, we must never talking about solar as a percent of plant capacity, because a coal plant, a nuclear plant might run at 80% capacity. A solar plant runs at 30% capacity because the sun isn't there all the time. So we must always talk about the energy produced in kilowatt hours. Um, and at this stage, I think it's a couple of percent, but the point is that it is happening and the logjam has burst, and solar and wind are coming in with a vengeance and will continue to do so. However, it's not going to be quick enough to decarbonize the grid, to make our exports clean enough to avoid European carbon taxes. So companies need to be thinking, and I'm sure you all are, you've all heard about this, you need to be thinking about getting your own supplies of clean electricity from the whole host of suppliers that are popping up over the country, of course, constrained by the transmission grid capacity. So just when you release the logjam on the generation of electricity from solar and wind, you think, whoops, not enough transmission capacity. And that's life. That's what I keep saying. Everyone muddles through and hits, you fix one problem, you hit another one. But that's the way it is, and you just got to do the best you can.
Yeah, and to the point that you made earlier as well, it's it's actually for me. I don't want us to kind of too loudly for the minister to say no. Load shedding will be something of the past in a year or two from now, because I'm like, then people may just decide to take temporary look at temporary alternatives instead of really kind of making a significant fundamental shift into something completely different. And to your point, a very good example of the behavioral change that brought about. And I think, we're becoming much more, I mean, to be quite honest, and I say that at my own peril, but, I've become much more conscious of the impact of switching on my kettle, on my electricity usage, which in the past, it was just so easy to do. So to some extent, to the point you made, we also need to look at the positives that come from what seems to be a disaster for us, and build on that and focus on that. But I also think, in conclusion, Dave, what I hear you saying is for companies in this country to, as I said, kind of alluded to earlier, there's a two-prong, strategy here. On the one hand, you really need to make climate change part of your business strategy. It needs to be a boardroom topic. We as directors need to take accountability and responsibility for what our companies are doing, and not, because of load shedding challenges, but because of climate change, and that even if load shedding is back, we still need to continue to look at alternative energy supplies, etc. So that's on the one side. But on the other side, if I hear you, it's really also, we need to be prepared for the consequences of where the world is heading. It is going to impact us financially. It's going to impact us reputationally. It's going to impact, at different levels. And so that's also, unfortunately, something that would need to stay very much high on the list of
Yes,
priorities of any company.
indeed. Absolutely.
I think we've run out of time. There's so much more that we could have discussed, and I just want to thank everyone that has stayed online with us. We will, like always, also put this out on social media. I will definitely be one that will be distributing this recording to as wide as possible, Dave, so that we can get this message, really out. And I want to encourage all of you to, when you do receive the recording or you find a link to it, please circulate it amongst, your sphere of influence, your network, it's really important that we keep the conversation going and we do not take our foot off of the accelerator here. But Dave, from my side, thank you so much. Really, I always so enjoy listening to you. I'm going to send this to my children in Europe as well to hear what they can expect from your statistics. But thank you from our side at Flirt Rock and for everyone. And yeah, just wishing you a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. And tell your children to stop the carbon tax on the imports.
I'll ask them to do the utmost for us. Thanks, Dave. Have a good
Thank
afternoon,
you.
everyone. Thank you. Bye
Bye.
bye. Thank you, Dave.